So this is really about domain 2, though. It's how do I reach an overall judgment for domain 2 when I use the 2 sections, adherence and assignment. So I think it's a bit different to what it's obviously different to what you're actually talking about. So I don't know whether you want to.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. How to reach a domain?
So I think this person's talking about domain 2 specifically and talking about the effect of adherence and assignment, but actually you would only specify one of those to assess.
So I think the question is how to do if there's a different judgment on assignment to intervention and assignment to adherence to intervention. How would you combine those two? But you wouldn't combine those two. Those results would go into 2 different meta-analyses. The way I see it, you wouldn't combine it at study level because you would do a different analysis for that. I think. Yeah,
so you would pre-specify which of the 2 that you were interested in. If you were interested in both, that would be fine if you justified that. But you would do it, like Jelena said, you would do it separately. So you would go through all of the domains and answer domain 2 for adherence, and then go through with them all and look at assignment, and then you would have 2 overall judgments for either, one for either.
So the overall risk of bias judgment, it means it's overall across domains for that result. But if you would then include this result in a meta-analysis, but you'd never combine results that are assessed for assignment and adherence into the same meta-analysis. So I would not see a reason to combine them. Yeah. But perhaps, the seminar for the domain 2 is available online, so there might be some more detailed answers there. Any more?
Yeah, another one is, where do we indicate which result outcome we are using the tool for?
Where do we indicate which result outcome we are using for 2 or 4?
The tool for, so in the Excel document, I think that the person means, so you can specify the outcome. So on your screen now, you've got SAEs.
Oh, yes. So yeah, this is based relatively on the on what the award document looks like roughly. But yeah, you could specify there, and this would get populated into Excel like a normal Excel spreadsheet.
If the results of low versus high risk are different, how do you approach the abstract writing? Do you present overall results plus low risk of bias, or do you present only low risk? Thanks.
Well, I mean, again, it's not really, I can't make this decision, but probably what I would do, I would, if they're clearly quite different, the low and high risk of bias, then again, I shouldn't make the decision after seeing the results. So at the approachable stage, I would make a decision which approach to take. So either to go with restricting to lower risk of bias, or doing sort of subgroups, and with subgroups then deciding what to present in abstract is a more complex choice. If there is a big difference, I would probably highlight that in the abstract that we have found in low risk of bias study the results such, but not in high risk of bias studies, because that's a finding in itself.
Okay, how do you present findings if meta-analysis isn't feasible due to heterogeneity?
Okay, so in theory, all of this should apply to synthesis in general. So if you can't do a meta-analysis, you're probably doing some sort of narrative synthesis, and it's more complex. So you will probably be drawing some conclusions, doing the synthesis in sort of a non-statistical way. And when doing that, it would be useful to bring risk of bias into it. Now, it's difficult to do that. You can't categorize things like you would normally in a meta-analysis on a display. I mean, you could probably use some categorization between tables, but it is more difficult. I don't really have a straight answer to that, or a direct answer, but it would be important to bring the risk of bias into that narrative synthesis, or some sort of descriptive display in tables or something like that.
What if I'm conducting...
Do you have anything to add to this?
Have I got anything to add? We do have some guidance about if you're using synthesis without meta-analysis. We do have some suggestions if you contact the method support unit about what to do. It's basically about including the overall risk of bias in the table, but you can use RobViz as well and import the figure into Redman Web. If you're, if you can still display results in forest plots and have the traffic lights there as well.
Oh, yes.
Even if you're not combining the studies. So I mean, as Jelena said, it really depends what type of synthesis, what you're actually doing with the results.
Yeah.
We have another question. What if I'm conducting a systematic review only and I want to create a figure using RobViz? I have used the 2 sections and I got 2 different judgments for domain 2. Do I choose between the assignment and adherence sections? And if so, my overall judgment will depend on what I have chosen. So I think it was going back to that original question about looking at both assignments and adherence.
Well, I mean, maybe we are not understanding this question correctly, or maybe I'm not understanding it, but I would kind of treat these separately. And is there a measure?
They'd be done. Yeah, there'd be 2 separate analyses, whether you're looking at assignment or adherence. In Redman Web, you can only display one or the other. So if if people do decide to look at both for one outcome, you need to justify that, and you can then use RobViz to display the results.
Thank you.
When limiting the main analysis to studies with low risk of bias, is there any implications on the assessment of reporting bias and grade?
Okay, so that's a good question. So do we mean by reporting bias, is it in grade? So that would be sort of publication bias. So it's not like they are missing, they are there, you just excluded them because of bias. So I guess this is where we hit that. I think it's generally a trade-off between bias and precision. I wouldn't think, I hadn't talked about this before, so I might not give the correct answer. But I think I wouldn't downgrade it for publication bias unless there are other evidence that there are additional trials carried out for which we haven't found the results. But perhaps this might be some additional guidance might be needed for this.
I think it depends what you pre-specify, that the authors pre-specify that they're going to do, and if, say, they were going to do the sensitivity analyses to look at the overall risk of bias, then that could be included in the comments section of grade. If and then you obviously make the decision to downgrade based on if the sensitivity analysis obviously has an impact on the results. I'm not sure about the reporting bias part.
Yeah, I think it refers to reporting bias in grade, which is generally about publication bias, because the selective reporting we are including in the ROB, so that would be caught with the ROB tool. And that's referred to results that you have. So this is looking at missing evidence, basically.
Is it impossible to include a score of risk of bias in the weight of the study?
Okay, so I didn't talk about the down weighting. I don't know what you mean by score, because it's not numeric, it's a color. there are weighting methods, but they are using Bayesian approaches, and they're not widely accepted. It might be that there's further development that makes them easier to use in the future. However, I think that the main problem with those things is that they use either expert opinion or empirical evidence from other studies, or a combination of the two. And there are kind of potential issues with both of these approaches, or there are people who criticize or critique both approaches. So it's certainly not universally accepted approach. So that's why I didn't talk about it, and I don't think they're necessarily recommended. They do require quite advanced skills to apply. But if that was what you were asking, if it's about whether you can convert the ROB judgment into a numerical score and then use that, that's not recommended.
Okay, if we decide to only use low or some concerns as the basis of our results, how do we address this in the text of the review for the sake of transparency?
Well, I just write that the primary analysis includes only studies of low and risk of bias and some concerns. I just made that clear.
Yeah, and then whether that decision was made, in the protocol, or whether it's a post hoc decision.
Yeah, you could state in the matters that at the protocol stage we have decided to do this. And
should the strategy for incorporating and presenting risk of bias be published in the review protocol prior to starting the review? Otherwise, the review may be at risk of selective reporting bias.
Yes, so in most of these cases, I said these strategies should be in the protocol. So certainly the approach, whether you're going to go with restriction or subgroups and exploration, should be in the protocol. And then also, if you are going with subgroups, I think you have a similar decision there. Which of these three or four even estimates will be the one that goes into the summary of findings or your main conclusions. So generally, those things should be decided a priori. But I accept that in some situations, it might be that you have decided to restrict and you haven't got anything that's at low risk of bias, and all the studies that have some risk or some concerns or high risk of bias. And then maybe you are forced to include everything, but you will kind of account for it in grade, I guess, and end up with very low quality evidence.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the Method Support Unit have developed a protocol checklist, and specifying whether you're going to consider a sensitivity or subgroup analyses for overall risk of bias is included in that checklist. And as Jelena said, obviously decisions can change, but obviously the point is about being transparent about those. And in Cochrane reviews, there is a differences between protocol and review section that you can list any changes.
Yeah, and often you'll see people say, we have planned to do this, but what we have found made that impossible, and therefore we have, had a plan B, basically.
If we're planning to only include and meta-analyse low risk of bias results, how does that affect study inclusion? Should we exclude quasi-randomised trials, small studies, or even non-blinded studies?
No, just because your primary analysis strategy means that your primary analysis will only include low and some lower risk of bias studies. It doesn't mean you would exclude studies at high risk of bias. Now, for some reviews, it might be appropriate to only include non-blinded studies. If there is a particularly good reason that only blinded studies are relevant, that maybe in some situations that might be acceptable. Certainly, you can exclude quasi-randomized studies. I think often they are often excluded from most Cochrane reviews. I think so. I think it's more common that they're excluded than included. That was my impression, certainly, Kerry.
What about reviews where all the studies will be at high risk of bias because blinding is impossible? Obviously, restricting to low risk of bias is not going to work.
Well, indeed, and when I talked about option 3, the narrative synthesis, I said that if you have a review in which all studies are at high risk of bias or all have some concerns, since there is no difference, then the subgroups are not going to be useful for you. You can't restrict to just low risk of bias. So your only option really is to include all of them, but then you still have this option of taking into account the overall risk of bias across studies in your grade assessment, and it will then downgrade your certainty of evidence.
Okay, there are a couple of Cochrane-specific ones I can just quickly answer, so we're nearly out of time. RevMan Web, only official Cochrane authors can use that functionality. That's correct, only Cochrane authors can use RevMan Web, and if you want risk of bias 2 switched on, you need to contact support at cochrane.org. After speaking with your managing editor and the CRG to see if they're happy for authors to do that, and obviously thinking about the necessary considerations for the protocol. Someone has said they're having issues with Excel. There is an email address on the Excel sheet for you to contact if there are any particular problems, and they can advise you on that. And is risk of bias 2 going to become mandatory? There is a statement that's going to be put out soon. For Cochrane, it's not going to become mandatory. The people are going to be able to have the choice at the moment between using risk of bias 1 and risk of bias 2. We're not sure if and when it will become mandatory, but look out for those communications soon if you are a Cochrane author.